I still remember the clink of wine glasses and the soft hum of laughter as I sat at the long oak dining table in my parents' immaculately curated home in Connecticut. Everything about the room was a performance, down to the symmetrical floral arrangements, the candlelight that flickered just enough to feel expensive, and the perfectly chilled Sauvignon Blancs that flowed like clockwork. Nothing was left to chance, not the line and napkins, not the guest list, and certainly not the script. Around the table sat my parents' usual circle, corporate executives, old family friends, and their country club companions, the kind of people who wore confidence like a tailored suit and judged success by its ZIP code. Everyone looked polished, practiced, and just self-satisfied enough to believe their laughter was evidence of charm rather than insulation from discomfort. It was the kind of evening that had been happening since I was a kid, though back then I was expected to serve hors d'oeuvres and disappear. Now, I was 29, still seated at the table, but still somehow on the fringes of the conversation, as though my chair came with an asterisk. My father was in his element, retelling one of his oldest business stories with all the polished rhythm of a man who had recited it at too many golf outings. Everyone leaned in at the predictable punchline. My mother, never one to be outshone, followed with a theatrical sigh about the headaches of organizing this year's fundraiser for the preservation of something, though even she didn't seem convinced it mattered. I sat quietly, sipping from a glass I hadn't asked to be poured, the wine bitter in ways that had nothing to do with tannins. Then it happened, the moment they couldn't resist. "Claire's, still figuring things out," my mom said, tilting her head like a sitcom mother explaining her daughter's liberal arts phase. She raised two fingers in air quotes, her rings catching the candlelight as if they too needed to perform. "You know how it is, kids these days and their startups." Startups, she said it like it was a rash. There was a pause, tight, artificial, and then my dad, without looking at me, added, "Unemployed." He chuckled. "But she makes great coffee." Laughter erupted like a spark caught dry leaves. It wasn't even the joke that stung. It was how comfortably it slid out of his mouth, how naturally they dismissed years of effort as a cute inconvenience. I could feel the eyes around the table, sympathetic in a condescending sort of way. People who had never built anything themselves but were experts at measuring worth in job titles and LinkedIn endorsements. They didn't ask what I did, they didn't want to know. In their eyes, I was the adult child who had returned home not to regroup but to retreat. To them, I was the silent failure hidden in the guest room upstairs, forgotten between promotions and stock splits. But what none of them knew, not even the people who had raised me, was that I had just closed a $1.2 million seed round. 12 months of pitching, failing, reworking, crying at my desk at 3 a.m., and clawing my way through rejections had just paid off. The ink on the contract was still drying, and my lead investor, the man who had seen what they never did, was walking through that very door in 10 minutes. And for once, I didn't plan to stay quiet. This wasn't new. That night at the dinner table was just the latest chapter in a long, quiet history of being misunderstood, misread, really, by the people who were supposed to know me best. My parents never really saw me, not in any real way. They saw versions of me that fit into neat little boxes they could understand. The rebel, the artist, the eccentric middle child who colored outside the lines because she didn't know how to follow them. It had always been Michael, my older brother, who wore the family pride like a crown. He walked into law school with a scholarship and walked out with a 6-figure job offer. He had the kind of ambition my parents could recognize, predictable, prestigious, tied to things that could be framed and hung on walls. Then there was Vanessa, graceful, polished, fluent in the language of upper-crust social cues. She married a neurosurgeon before 30, organized charity galas for fun, and knew exactly how to smile for holiday photos. And then there was me, Claire, the creative one. In our house, that label wasn't a compliment, it was a soft dismissal, a placeholder for failure wrapped in glitter. It meant impractical. It meant unserious. It meant we hope she marries someone who can afford her hobbies. When I told them I wanted to major in graphic design, they stared like I'd just announced I was joining a cult. My dad's mouth tightened, the same way it did when someone ordered decaf coffee around him. "Design?" he said, like the word had an unpleasant taste. My mom just sighed and muttered something about phases. And when I pitched my idea for an AI-driven e-commerce line, custom-fit clothing generated through a personalized algorithm, my dad blinked and said, "Sounds complicated. Why not just work at an agency for a few years first?" My mom smiled tightly. "Oh, that's cute. Maybe you can sell on Etsy. When my startup didn't take off in the first 3 months, they saw it as validation. Proof that their skepticism was realism, that I should have listened to them. When I moved back home to save money and bootstrap development costs, I told them it was temporary. I just needed breathing room to get the prototype stable, finalize the branding, pitch to a few more VCs. But they didn't hear that. All they saw was a grown daughter moving back into her childhood room, like someone dragging a suitcase full of broken dreams. They never asked about my work. Not once. Not when I skipped meals to hit deadlines. Not when I spent 10 hours rewriting code that refused to cooperate. Not when I came home from meetings with blistered feet and a voice hoarse from pitching. They only noticed the hours I slept in, the nights I paced the hallway, the coffee I spilled on the kitchen counter. And the worst part? I once overheard them, late at night, whispering through the thin walls of the house I no longer felt welcome in. "She's wasting her life," my mom murmured. "She'll never stick to anything," my dad answered. "If she were serious," he added, "she'd get a real job." I stood on the other side of the wall, frozen, not angry, just hollow. They didn't see the battle I was fighting. They didn't know how many doors had slammed in my face, how many nights I'd cried over investor rejections, how many mornings I forced myself to keep building anyway. They didn't know. Because they never asked. And every assumption they made cut a little deeper than the last. Just as dessert was being served, some overpriced creme brulee shipped in from a boutique bakery my mother claimed had a 3-month waiting list, the doorbell rang. The sound cut clean through the symphony of idle chatter, polished laughter, and the faint clinking of silverware on porcelain. For a split second, everyone paused, as if startled by the intrusion of real life into their carefully staged tableau. "Can you get that, Claire?" My mom asked without looking at me, her voice as breezy as it was dismissive. The kind of tone she used with servers at brunch. I didn't answer. I simply rose and walked through the hallway, my heels echoing against the marble tile like a slow, deliberate drum roll. And then I opened the door. There he was. Daniel Grant, angel investor, tech visionary, the man who had built $2 billion companies by 35 and yet still managed to seem like the most grounded person in any room. He wasn't flashy, no Rolex, no entourage, just a crisp navy coat, soft eyes, and a presence that immediately redefined the air around him. I smiled, the first real smile I'd allowed myself all evening. "Daniel, so glad you made it." "Wouldn't have missed it," he said, stepping inside, shaking off the cold with effortless confidence. He handed me his coat, gave me a warm nod, and then turned toward the dining room, where time had seemingly frozen. He walked in, and the room shifted. The air got denser. Conversations tapered off. Heads tilted like sunflowers toward a new source of energy. Everyone noticed the difference, even if they couldn't name it. There was something magnetic about Daniel, an unspoken authority paired with authentic warmth, the rare combination that made people want to impress him and be near him all at once. My parents stood, awkwardly. My mom's expression faltered for the first time that night, lips pulling into a strained approximation of a smile. My father, always the alpha in the room, seemed suddenly small. Daniel greeted the guests with the practiced charm of someone who had dined with presidents and pitched to boardrooms. And then, casually like it was the most natural thing in the world, he placed a hand on my back, light but deliberate. "I had to come," he said, scanning the room. "When Claire invited me, I knew this dinner wasn't just any dinner." You could hear the confusion tightening in the silence. My mom blinked. "You two know each other." Daniel let out a soft chuckle. "She didn't tell you." His gaze swept the table, not seeking attention, but commanding it nonetheless. "Claire is the founder of Layered. You've probably heard of it by now. The AI fashion brand disrupting custom-fit e-commerce. I'm her lead investor." The silence that followed wasn't just quiet, it was absolute, electric, as if the entire room had momentarily forgotten how to breathe. And then, finally, a voice cracked through it. "Wait," one of the guests said, wide-eyed. "That Layered? I just read about that in Forbes." My father's face lost all color. My mother's smile trembled, then disappeared entirely, like a curtain suddenly yanked shut. Daniel, completely unfazed, gave a small nod. "Yep, her company. I funded it." The words landed like a dropped glass, shattering every assumption, every whispered insult, every rolled eye that had shadowed me for years. And for the first time that night, I wasn't the background character in someone else's dinner story. I was the headline. The energy in the room didn't just shift, it snapped. Like someone had pulled a rug out from under an entire belief system and left everyone scrambling to find their footing. 5 minutes earlier, I had been the invisible daughter, the cautionary tale whispered about in manicured circles. But now, with Daniel's calm revelations still hanging in the air, those same dinner guests who had chuckled at my expense were suddenly transformed. Their expressions rearranged, curiosity replacing condescension, admiration clumsily filling the silence they'd once weaponized. "So, Claire," one of them started, clearing her throat as if trying to reset the entire evening. "What's it like, running a tech startup at your age?" Another leaned forward, elbows now on the table where minutes ago they had recoiled. "Are you planning to sell the company or scale? I have a friend at Andreessen Horowitz." And then the real cherry on top. "Do you have any hiring needs? My niece just graduated with a marketing degree. She's very driven." They all came in waves, questions, compliments, feigned fascination. But it wasn't about me, not really. It was about proximity, closeness to relevance, to money, to the glittering promise of being associated with something real. My brother Michael, the family's gold standard, the one whose law degree was a kind of shield against ever being doubted, actually turned to me with a grin I didn't recognize. "Hey, if you ever need someone to look over your partnership agreements, I'd be happy to take a look." I blinked. My sister Vanessa, still perfectly glossed in designer everything, leaned across the table like we were old friends. "Claire, seriously, OMG, I love what you're doing. AI and fashion. That's like genius. We should totally collab." I almost laughed. Not out of spite, but disbelief. Just hours ago, she was complaining about me still living at home, saying it in that performative stage whisper way she thought was subtle. And now she wanted to build a brand with me. But the most jarring shift wasn't them, it was my parents. They sat there, still, silent, shell-shocked. Their mouths had lost the easy curve of superiority. Their eyes darted, not with authority, but confusion. My father, the ever-composed executive, looked like someone who'd just seen a ghost. My mother's perfectly curled hair and pearls felt suddenly costume-like, ill-fitting against the uncertainty softening her face. For the first time in my life, they didn't look like they were judging me. They looked unsure of themselves. And that did something to me I wasn't ready for. When the last guest left, when the laughter faded and the house returned to its familiar quiet, my mother found me alone in the kitchen. I was rinsing out a coffee mug I hadn't touched all evening, just going through the motions. She stepped in, arms crossed, not defensively, but like she was holding herself together. "Why didn't you tell us?" she asked, barely above a whisper. I didn't turn around. Because every time I tried, you treated it like it was a phase, like it was a joke. I didn't need applause. I just needed you not to laugh. There was a long silence behind me, the kind of silence that carries weight. She started to speak. I heard her breath hitch, but nothing came out. Instead, she picked up a dish towel and began wiping down the counter. It was already spotless. A week later, my dad forwarded me a link to a Bloomberg article titled "Layered," the AI fashion startup disrupting the industry's core. No message, no subject line, just a blue link and a solitary thumbs-up emoji. No, I'm proud of you. No, I was wrong. Not even a congrats. It should have made me angry, and part of me, deep, bruised, still tender, wanted it to. But all I felt was a muted sort of release. That emoji wasn't the validation I once craved. It wasn't an apology. But it was, in its own brittle way, an acknowledgement, a quiet surrender, and honestly, that was enough. Because I hadn't built Layered for them. I didn't fight through back-to-back rejections, sleepless nights, and lonely wins so I could finally hear my father say, "Good job." I built it because I believed in something no one else could see, not even the people who were supposed to see me best. I had a vision, a hunger, a flicker of defiance that whispered, "What if they're all wrong?" And they were. That night, when Daniel sat beside me at the dinner table, placed his hand lightly on my back, and casually dropped the truth like a match onto dry leaves, I felt the world tilt. Not just theirs, mine. Until that moment, I had spent years playing defense, softening my ambition so it didn't make people uncomfortable, dimming my fire so my family wouldn't roll their eyes, pretending I was still figuring things out because it made them feel better to believe I was lost. But the second Daniel said her company, I funded it, something sharp and dormant inside me woke up. Being underestimated isn't just painful, it's corrosive. It chips away at your certainty, lures your instincts, makes you question your own momentum. You start to wonder if maybe they're right, if maybe the silence around your effort means you're shouting into a void. But when you prove them wrong, not with a scream, but with receipts, data, and undeniable traction, there's a certain kind of power in that. It's not the kind that demands attention. It doesn't throw a victory party. It doesn't need to. It just arrives, calm, composed, and undeniable. Dressed in quiet confidence, backed by numbers, surrounded by people who saw your worth long before the world caught up. That night, something in the atmosphere shifted, yes, but more importantly, something in me realigned. I stopped waiting for their permission to take up space. I stopped needing their approval to believe I belonged. Because the truth is, I do. I've always belonged at the table, whether they pulled out a chair for me or not. That was the night I reclaimed my voice, not by raising it, but by letting my success speak in a language they couldn't ignore. The room had gone quiet not because I demanded it, but because they finally listened. And now? Now, I don't measure my worth in their nods or their outdated expectations. I measure it in growth metrics, in customer satisfaction, in the fire I light in every woman who sees what I've built and thinks, maybe I can do it too. I wasn't unemployed. I was building an empire. And I am no longer asking anyone to believe in it. They can watch it rise.